this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
During the Second World War, the people of Leningrad endured a brutal 900-day siege, facing relentless bombing, shelling and starvation. In early 1943, the Red Army broke through the blockade, marking a crucial turning point. Despite setbacks, the Soviet forces and civilians held firm, and by late 1943, the Germans, weakened by harsh conditions, began to retreat. In episode 202, we discussed the siege up to 1942. I'm joined once more by Prit Butar to pick up the story of the siege being lifted, which is covered in his latest book, Hero City, Leningrad 1943-44. Prit, welcome back. We should perhaps start by reminding listeners what the situation was like at the end of 1942, the start of 1943, which is where we left it last time.
Geographically, the situation is pretty much unchanged from the end of 1941. The Germans are still on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting Leningrad off from the rest of the Soviet Union. And the Red Army has made repeated attempts to batter its way through that German corridor to lift the siege at enormous cost and very, very little gain in terms of territory. But there are several changes that have taken place over the preceding months. The first is that the population of Leningrad itself is now a fraction of what it was at the beginning of the war. Tragically, a lot of people starved to death and died from exposure in the first winter and from German shelling and bombing, but far larger numbers were actually evacuated over the frozen Lake Ladoga during the first winter. This, combined with better organized transport of supplies into the city during the summer, means that during the second winter, the city is in far better shape to endure without all of the terrible, terrible suffering of that first winter. It's also a much milder winter, which also helps matters a great deal. There's also a great change in the physical strength of the two sides. By the time that the German armies reached the outskirts of Leningrad, the divisions were quite depleted and had suffered substantial casualties. But this has now only got worse in the fighting of the months that followed the arrival of the Germans and the establishment of the siege. Although they beat off every attempt by the Red Army to break the siege ring, this was at the cost of quite heavy casualties, and although they received replacement drafts, these didn't really compensate them for the loss of personnel, particularly the experienced officers and NCOs. In any army with a tradition of leading from the front, it's always these people who suffer the heaviest losses, and the German army was no exception in this sense. There were also changes in the structure of German infantry divisions, which were intended to improve the firepower of the divisions. So they, for example, had far more by way of support weapons and automatic weapons. But the reduction in personnel meant that although the division had greater firepower, it was still required to cover the same physical length of front line. As a result, losing 100 men in early 1943 is going to have a much more serious consequence on your ability to continue operating than it would have in earlier years of the war, because that's a bigger percentage of your overall strength. So the rate at which the fighting power of German infantry units declines once combat starts is actually much higher, even though they start the battle in slightly better shape. Conversely, the Red Army is continuing its very, very painful evolution from a very clumsy and inadequate force at the beginning of the war into something that, whilst it remains clumsy and prone to heavy casualties, is a far more formidable opponent. There has been a degree of, if you like, natural selection amongst the officers, with officers at all levels tending to be more capable than was the case in the early months of the war. Nonetheless, it remains very much a blunt instrument, and every Soviet operation is going to result in major losses. On a higher level, it's worth commenting that this general acceptance in the Soviet Union that all operations result in six-figure losses accounts for a lot of the friction between Stalin on the one hand and the Western leaders on the other over the endless delays, or endless from the point of view of the Soviet Union, in starting a second front in the West. When Stalin is told by Churchill that, we can't risk a premature invasion of France, which will only cost us 100,000 men for no gain, Stalin kind of looks at him and says, well, what exactly is your point? I lose that in every single operation I start. So the two sides are different in many respects from, at the beginning of the siege, but physically on the ground, very little has changed, and the front lines are broadly where they were when the Germans first established the siege.
Do the Germans still expect a victory at Leningrad? And what does victory look like from the German point of view, almost 2 years in?
It's a very, very good point, and it should be borne in mind that at the end of 1942, this coincides with the culmination of the Stalingrad battles and the encirclement of Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Prior to that, Manstein's 11th Army had been moved north during 1942 from Crimea, where it had successfully captured Sevastopol, in anticipation of a renewed assault around Leningrad. The intention wasn't physically to storm the city, but to cut it off from Lake Ladoga so that a second winter siege would be far more effective. In the event, this operation didn't take place, largely because of another Soviet attempt to lift the siege, soaking up the German troops as they arrived, and also the crisis that then developed around Stalingrad and around the Rzhev salient near Moscow, and the diversion of German troops to both of those fronts. So, if you like, this was the last concrete plan for an offensive operation, specifically to capture or to make the fall of Leningrad at least more straightforward. There was some very, very broad brush conversations as the dust settled from Stalingrad and plans began for the Battle of Kursk. The Germans were broadly talking about, well, once we have successfully completed operations around Kursk and resumed our offensive operations, there will be potential for a new offensive in the north to isolate and destroy Leningrad. But it's worth remembering that was very much always the tone of the German approach to Leningrad. The intention wasn't to repeat the storming of the city as was seen in Stalingrad. It was to isolate, starve, and destroy the city through a mixture of aerial and artillery bombardment.
In which case, are they expecting the Russians to counterattack in that winter of 43? Because in many respects, if the Russians are holding the city, and they've actually got supplies coming in, they've stabilised their defence of the city. Were the Germans expecting the Russians to, because it's Operation Iskra, isn't it, the Russians launched in that January of 43. Does that take the Germans by surprise?
I don't think it does. It may have taken them by surprise, if you like, at a tactical or operational level. But overall, in strategic terms, you're absolutely right. The Germans can't have been unaware of the fact that the Red Army remained very strong and that further attempts to lift the siege were inevitable. I suppose the most positive spin the Germans could put on this was, well, if the Red Army attacks, it'll be another opportunity to inflict heavy losses on them, grind them down so that when we resume offensive operations, the balance of power might be more in our favor. It's worth realizing that in 1942, the munitions output of factories in Leningrad actually exceeded the requirements of the garrison, and Leningrad was a net exporter of military supplies to the rest of the Soviet Union across Lake Ladoga. The Germans can't have been unaware of this, so they must have known that both the city's garrison and the armies outside the siege perimeter were very strong and were likely to make a further attempt. Precisely where it was going to fall and when it was going to fall, well, you're now into difficult territory, because although they may not have had specific intelligence that the Soviets are going to attack on this date and in this sector, the geography of the terrain means that the likelihood of an attack occurring in designated areas was actually very high. There were only a few areas where the Red Army could attack. The actual corridor stretching up to Lake Ladoga that was occupied by the Germans was an obvious target. It was only, 8, 9, 10 miles wide, and that was therefore the shortest distance the Red Army would have to cover to lift the siege. The only other real axis for an advance had been attempted in 1942 along a railway line that approaches Leningrad from the southeast. So although this was a huge battlefield, the Germans were able to concentrate defensive forces on the likely sectors. They also had the huge advantage that the Army Group North had the bulk of the Wehrmacht's heavy siege artillery. And although these guns were required for bombardments of Leningrad itself, the range of these weapons was such that if a relief attempt was made, it was relatively straightforward for these gun batteries to switch their fire to help defeat the Soviet attacks. So although the Germans know that an attack is coming and they know roughly where it's coming, they're in pretty good shape, they think, at least, in order to stop that, or at the very least, inflict such heavy losses upon the Soviets that it'll make their own, at this stage, rather tentative plans for new offensive operations much easier to implement.
When Operation Iskra is launched, I'm right in saying it's that corridor to the south of Lake Ladoga that they're aiming to go through, which in itself is overlooked by some heights that are occupied by the Germans, and that there had been fighting there the previous year. Are the Russians doing anything different? Can we point to any form of learning curve that the Russian army is going through for this campaign?
My goodness, it's a complicated question, and in this case, the short answer is they don't really do anything different, because although the Red Army is getting better at some things, it's not getting better at all things. The areas that the Red Army has seen maximum improvement in over the preceding year are, for example, the use of armor, as is seen around Stalingrad, the better use of artillery, and particularly moving guns and ammunition forward once an offensive begins. Neither of these really matter when you're only pushing forward 8 miles through what is effectively a continuous defensive belt. The Germans know that this is coming, so that corridor stretching up to Lake Ladoga is just a continuous barbed wire entanglement with minefields, trenches, bunkers, interlocking fields of fire between them. And as you say, immediately to their south, the Signavino Heights. It's worth pointing out, though, that although we talk about the Signavino Heights, we're not talking about a mountain range. This is very, very flat terrain, and these are heights in the form of low hills, probably even lower than, the Berkshire Downs, for example, in southern England. Yet, in a very flat landscape, they give you an enormous advantage.
I wasn't sure how much we could point at things such as forward airstrips and Soviet tanks with radios as some element of a learning curve that might have affected something. They're still too early.
I don't think so in this case, because this is a mainly infantry artillery operation, because it's not tank terrain. B, it's on a very limited frontage, so there isn't any room for improvising or of sudden maneuver to take advantage of enemy weaknesses. This is very much a matter of, guys, you've got 8 miles to go, rock on, just batter your way through it. In fairness, in previous occasions, the Red Army had succeeded in punching its way forward at enormous cost over the sort of distances required to break the siege ring. But on previous attempts, the main problem was the initial breakthrough in the German front line was on a very narrow front. And that resulted in the forces that continued the advance effectively being constrained. All supplies to them and reinforcements had to pass through a very narrow breach in the German line, with the German forces either side of that breach able to put down suppressing fire and harassing fire with artillery and machine guns, etc. On this occasion, the advance actually succeeds in pushing the Germans back on a broad enough front that the constant threat in the previous offensives of the Germans pinching off the breakthrough. That doesn't really arise on this occasion because the Germans are broadly pushed back as the Red Army intended.
I don't know how much Zhukov was involved with the planning. He seems to arrive not long before the operation happens. Is there anything he's adding to the operation other than being sort of the figurehead to another large attritional battle?
What he adds is his inimitable style of bullying and harassing his subordinates. The planning has been carried out largely by the generals on the ground, and he spent the winter of 42-43 hopping between different sectors. He is one of these envoys that Stalin sends to oversee operations. He was involved in some degree in the encirclement of the Germans at Stalingrad. He would later claim an enormous amount of credit for that, but it doesn't truly belong with him. It belongs with Vasilevsky, who was a very self-effacing and, in many respects, generous man in his memoirs and didn't claim the glory that was his lot. Zhukov also claimed great credit for the general collapse of the German lines all the way across the Don and Donetsk fronts, yet that was more due to Voronov than Zhukov. The one battle in which Zhukov played an enormous part in that winter was yet another disastrous attempt to crush the Rzhev salient, but he's rather more reticent to claim responsibility for that disaster. And then he turns up in the north, where the operation is pretty much nailed down and planned, and all he does is just shout at the army and front commanders, urging them to go faster. I can't really see what else he adds to this battle.
Considering his slightly checkered sort of copybook of what he's achieved, it slightly surprises me that he's managed to stay in position and hasn't been either shot or shunted off somewhere else.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think that part of the answer lies in that by the end of the disastrous first few months of the war with Germany, Stalin realized that whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to fight this war with what he had. And you can't keep on shooting people and arresting them and dismissing them because you're kind of running out of generals by this stage, Also, there was a past history here which has an effect. Zhukov, if you like, he was in some respects, the military embodiment of so much of what Stalin personally believed in, this brutal imposition of command and control, this utterly inflexible refusal to accept failures by subordinates, etc., imposing iron discipline at every level, utterly ruthless character. And that was something that Stalin respected and quite liked. Even in the Red Army, where awareness of the losses suffered by Zhukov's operations was widespread, there was also a general understanding that where Zhukov is, there will also be victory. So casualties in the Red Army, and indeed if you look at the Russian army today, are not seen in the same manner as they are in Western armies. And it's something that I've thought about a lot in recent months. It seems to me that a lot of the difference between the Soviet and indeed the modern Russian approach to war is dictated, or rather the difference in that and the Western approach is down to the collective national memories of the First World War. So I see the unwillingness of Western powers, even today, to accept major casualties as owing its origins to the terrible slaughter of the First World War and the feeling of we cannot allow entire villages to lose their menfolk, of battalions made up of a bunch of pals from factories who joined up together to die en masse. By contrast, the Soviet Union and the modern Russian nation, which effectively inherited the Soviet Union's thinking in so many ways, remember, it wasn't a participant in the First World War. That was Imperial Russia. So they don't really see themselves as having that legacy. And, given the widespread level of illiteracy in Imperial Russia, war memorials wouldn't have had any real meaning because many of the millions who died in the First World War, their names weren't even recorded, really. And as a result, there wasn't this aversion to massive casualties that was seen in France and the United Kingdom and Canada, and to an extent in the United States. And also, this is a a nation that, after the terrible losses of the First World War, then experienced the terrible casualties of the Russian Civil War, the terrible purges that followed. Mass premature death is something that has been a characteristic of Soviet life for so long by 1943 that it's just accepted, and everyone turns and just shrugs and says, well, that's how it is. So yes, Zhukov was responsible for some appallingly high loss rates by Western standards, but from the Soviet point of view, the only thing that mattered was, is he giving you victory? And if he is, well, you kind of accept that as that is the price that the Red Army always pays for victory.
Just because I found it peculiar to move away from the Russians, the Spanish Blue Division are involved in the German defence, aren't they? And I thought just because of their oddity, and I suspect no one's ever heard of them, we don't hear much about their contribution to the German army on the Eastern Front.
They are an extraordinary bunch, and it is something that I think sheds so much light on so many different aspects of European history at that time. So you have this bunch who originally are largely made up of volunteers from Franco's Spain. So these are fascists who fought for Franco during the Spanish Civil War. They've now formed the new Spanish army. And in 1941, Franco offers to send a division in support of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Remember that the Soviet Union had provided enormous support for Franco's enemies in the Civil War in Spain, so he sees this as a form of revenge, if you like. This division is raised. It becomes formally part of the Wehrmacht as I think the 250th Infantry Division, but is also generally known as the Blue Division from the blue shoulder flashes that the soldiers carry. And from the outset, the Germans treat it with a level of contempt. And this gives an insight into the German mindset of that period, which also, in fairness, reflects the mindset of many other nations, though we kind of overlook this in the West. In short, the Germans don't really like the Spanish. They regard them as inferior. Their discipline is poor. Their uniforms look slovenly. They are deeply offended when the Spanish troops march into Spain and a German officer drives past a Spanish column to see a row of dead chickens hanging from the barrel of an anti-tank gun that's being dragged along a road. This is awful. Troops shouldn't behave like this in the field. They repeatedly blame the Spanish for showing brittleness and not standing and fighting as hard as they should have done. Yet at the same time, they have not provided the Spanish with the number of anti-tank guns, etc., that they had promised. And in fact, when you look at the performance of the Blue Division in the field, it really isn't that much worse, or any worse in many respects, than German divisions. But the elements of racism, if you like, that are so strong in German thinking at the time are in some respects no different from some of the comments recorded by British troops about Indian units that they were fighting alongside. And it was only after those Indian units had, if you like, proved themselves in battle that their views of those changed. And it's worth remembering that at this time, the United States Army was still fully segregated. So it is fascinating reading the German attitudes to this division, the way they're constantly, as soon as the Spanish give up some territory, well, what did we tell you? There were, these Spanish are rubbish, just like the Romanians and Italians and Hungarians. And yet, when German divisions give way, it's a matter of, well, they fought hard before they gave in. Well, actually, so did the Spanish and indeed the Romanians and Italians and Hungarians. But the Germans kind of overlook that. And the fascinating change of mood in these Spanish troops as the war progresses. First of all, these are boys from Barcelona and Cadiz and places like that. And yet they're on about the most northern part of the European battlefield. Can you imagine these guys having to endure freezing conditions, knee-deep in water, frozen water much of the time, in mud? And they're kind of wondering, what on earth have we got into? Why have we been sent to this hellhole in the north? And yet they continue to fight. There are fresh drafts rotated in as other men go home. The letters from these soldiers are very interesting, and they have little time for the way that the Germans treat them. Some are undoubtedly hardline fascists. just as racist as everybody else, very disparaging about the Soviets, about the Slavs, about the Jews, etc. But it's also worth bearing in mind that compared to Germany, Spain was very much an agricultural nation in the 1930s and 1940s. So these guys actually have a great deal in common with the ordinary Russian peasants amongst whom they find themselves, much like many of the Italian troops at the southern part of the Eastern Front, who ended up with remarkably good personal relations with many of the locals. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's a great rabbit hole to dive down.
What I find interesting is they're volunteering to be there because they're anti-communist. It's not as if they could be used in North Africa, which you would have thought they'd be more suitable, because that's not necessarily their ideological enemy, is the British.
Exactly. So you've got to use them somewhere where they can kill communists, but even then, you know what? You could have sent these guys to the southern sector where they're going to be a bit warmer. To put them outside Leningrad seems, what we would call cruel and unusual punishment, really. But there you go.
Now, that Russian offensive does create the land corridor and technically lifts the siege. Is that really a political victory rather than a strategic victory for the Russians?
Yeah, I think that it's exactly that. And I think the correct expression would be to say it breaks the siege ring, but it doesn't lift the siege per se. So there is now a narrow corridor, 4 or 5 miles wide along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. And the Soviets very rapidly build a railway along there to run supplies in. But remember, this is within easy artillery range of German positions, so they can shell it whenever they like. You can really only shuffle trains along that at night. And even then, you're taking a chance because the Germans are going to fire at random. Their guns are well zeroed in and they can hit the railroad whenever they like. But remember, this is happening at the same time as Stalingrad. So, in the south, we've destroyed a whole German army and thrown the hated fascists back. In the north, we've broken the siege ring. These are enormously important symbolic victories as much as military. But there's no doubt the situation remains precarious. It would not be beyond the ability of the Germans to re-establish a tight siege perimeter around Leningrad, and the Red Army is desperate to take the Signavino Heights in order to avoid oversight of the corridor and to push the Germans back. And this then leads to a further very bloody operation in the summer of 43 to storm the Signavino Heights from the north, to widen this corridor, if you like. And again, this fails with very, very heavy losses on the Red Army side. The Germans can take, solace from the fact that, yeah, we held our ground, we killed an awful lot of Soviet soldiers, but it also weakens the German divisions further. So Army Group North is becoming ever more brittle. Troops are being diverted off to deal with the growing crises in Ukraine. And those units that are left are receiving inadequate replacements. They're being asked to hold ever-increasing frontline lengths. So by the end of 1943, it's almost inevitable that if the German line can be broken, it's likely that Army Group North will be forced into a fairly precipitate withdrawal back towards the Baltic states.
It's a wonderful line you make in the book about it's madness to do the same thing time and time again and expect a different outcome, which is exactly what the Russians do, and get hundreds of thousands of casualties attempting to take those heights. It's von Kuchler, who's the German commander in 43 around Leningrad. What agency does he have over his troops? It occurs to me that Hitler is now starting to insert himself into the battle constantly. How much of this is a problem, Hitler's involvement for Kuchler in 43?
It's not so much a problem in 43 because, largely due to the failure of the Red Army to storm Signavino, etc., the battlefield is still relatively static. Sure, they've managed to batter this narrow corridor, but in any other sector, advancing 8 miles to secure a 5-mile wide corridor, let's face it, even in the failed Market Garden operation, the British forces did rather better than that in about 2 weeks, So it's not as if an awful lot has changed. So he doesn't require the level of flexibility that would put him in conflict with Hitler. And Kukla and his staff are having actually, let's face it, a very comfortable war. They're living in some requisitioned mansions, some distance behind the front line. And the front line hasn't moved at all since the siege perimeter was built, really. So they themselves are in very, very comfortable accommodation. They've settled in properly. They have well-established culinary services and laundry services and everything else. So life is pretty comfortable at the headquarters of Army Group North. And yeah, in other sectors, senior commanders are having to challenge the Führer's constant interference. But in the north, there isn't an awful lot happening. So the need doesn't really arise. And it's only in very early 1944 when the Red Army begins its very decisive attempt to break the siege definitively that Küchler finds himself having to face the same reality as Army Group commanders elsewhere, that actually the things that an Army Group commander or an Army commander needs to do are almost impossible when you have Hitler second-guessing you all the time and micromanaging from an enormous distance.
Is he allowed to finally withdraw from the heights when they become under pressure, or is it a German... I don't want to say the rout, because I'm not sure the Germans necessarily routed, but they're forced to withdraw?
It's more the latter. And again, the context of this is really important. It also highlights the appalling complications of the way that the Germans fought the war. So as it becomes clear that the Red Army in the winter of 43-44 is preparing for a very major operation against Army Group North, Küchler is putting increasing emphasis on this in his reports. And he's saying, I've got my troops dug in their frontline positions, but it would be quite nice to have a defensive line further back in case we do have to retreat. And he's given permission to build the Panther line along the old Estonian frontier. But he's not given any leeway in moving troops back, and Hitler insists on forward defense at all times, as he does everywhere. And, there's nothing new there. But the complicating factor here is Küchler, on the one hand, is saying, things could go bad very, very quickly here. My troops are very brittle, and we're not really in a position for a prolonged battle in our current positions. But Lindemann, who's one of his army commanders, is undermining him at every turn and boasting to Hitler about how strong his defenses are, how strong his divisions are, and it's not going to be a problem. We've killed the Bolsheviks every time they've come forward. We'll do it again. It'll be a massacre. Don't worry, mein Führer, I will deliver. And this reflects this awful quasi-Darwinism that Hitler encouraged at every single level of the Third Reich, whether we're talking about civil government or military, that he was very happy to play people off against each other. And given two conflicting opinions on, we can hold this position, actually we can't hold this position, guess what? He's going to choose the one that confirms his own bias rather than taking an objective point of view. Let's face it, in that sense, he's no different from most people. If they hear conflicting advice, they're going to listen to the one that sounds more palatable. Now, you or I thinking that way when it comes to deciding what we're going to buy in next week's groceries has slightly less consequence than the leader of a nation at war deciding on whose opinion he's going to follow when it comes to, an impending battle. So Küchler by now is beginning to have serious doubts about the ability of Army Group North to hold its advanced positions, but Lindemann is just destroying his arguments all the time. This has a fatal consequence in that it diminishes Küchler's standing in Hitler's eyes. So as we get to the end of 43 and into early 44, Hitler is already looking at Küchler with increasing doubt and thinking, you're just another of these generals who wants to retreat all the time. You're not made of the right stuff. You don't have the determination to fight, particularly when one of your subordinates is telling me that everything is fine. We're going to be able to hold this position. And of course, this then becomes a big factor once the Soviet breakout from Leningrad begins.
I've noted in my notes the timeline. Is he relieved before the Soviet breakout, or once it's all the front line's been?
No, he's relieved once the battle starts. So the Red Army is now basically consisting of if you like, three groupings. There is the mass of the Red Army outside the original siege perimeter to the east. So this is what was the Volkov front. You have the original Leningrad garrison, which has now established contact with the Volkov front along this tenuous corridor along the south side of Lake Ladoga. And then the third component lies to the west of Leningrad, where there is this enclave on the Baltic coast around Oranienbaum, which was originally created by the German advance to Leningrad. And they kind of left this there because they thought, well, the city's going to surrender at some point anyway, and we'll mop it up then. There's no point in throwing troops against this bridgehead, this pocket, when it's going to surrender anyway. But by the end of 1943, the whole of Second Shock Army has been moved into this pocket. So what then follows is a sequential operation. The first phase is that the Leningrad garrison attacks west towards Oranienbaum at the same time that Second Shock Army attacks east out of the Oranienbaum bridgehead to link up with the city garrison. As this operation is culminating and they are establishing contact, Volkov front then attacks from the east, while Leningrad front attacks towards them. So a sequential series of crises arise for the Germans, and at every turn, Küchler is contacting OKH and Berlin and saying, I really need to start pulling back here. Lindemann at first is saying, don't worry, it's all going swimmingly. We're massacring the Red Army. Everything's going well. Oh, no, it isn't. We're losing very, very badly, and my army's going to get annihilated in a minute. So at some point in all of this, poor old Küchler, I don't really have much sympathy for the man. He had very blood-stained hands from the occupation of the Baltic states and from the occupation of the area around Leningrad. But he keeps heading off to these meetings with Hitler and told, you must try harder. And he returns and says to his army and corps commanders, guys, you've got to try harder. And they're saying, are you kidding? The guys are dying in the front line in huge numbers. Eventually, he is replaced, and his replacement is no other than Lindemann, who has been telling Hitler all along that, yeah, we can fight this battle, we can win this battle, only to say later on, actually, I'm not so sure we can. In fact, beg your pardon, it isn't Lindemann. He sends Model up there to take command. Lindemann inherits from Model when he's sent elsewhere. So that is the end of Küchler's military career. He is dismissed, and Model, the so-called great defensive genius, arrives to take command. And by then, Army Group North is in full retreat. The siege has been lifted. There is this momentous day towards the end of January 44 when German artillery fires on Leningrad, and nobody at the time has any way of knowing that this is the last occasion German guns will be able to fire on the city. And so it's one of these moments that becomes momentous in hindsight. At the time, it's just, another daily event.
Is Model allowed to withdraw by Hitler? I mean, he has these sort of sword and shield tactics that he deploys, which I'm not sure are an excuse for him to withdraw.
So Model has, and people who've heard me talk about him in the past will know that I'm not a great believer in the defensive genius view of Model. I think that Model is, in some respects, he characterizes what Napoleon said when he was asking his subordinates about another general and said, what do you think of this guy? And they were saying, oh, he's pretty good. He knows how to handle artillery and cavalry. And Napoleon shakes his head and says, no, I mean, is he lucky? And I think Model has enjoyed considerable good fortune in his career. He inherits commands in moments of crisis, but often when the Red Army is already beginning to run out of momentum. And he then gets the credit for stopping the Soviet attack. He probably deserves great credit for the defense of the Rzhev salient, when he undoubtedly shows great skill in organizing ad hoc battle groups from rear area units, from stragglers, etc., and shuffling those around with great effect. He shows great resourcefulness in supplying them properly, getting them to the right place in a prompt manner. But in many other respects, he owes his success Because he arrives at the right moment as the Red Army offensive is slackening, so he's able to say, yeah, there you are, I stopped him. But also, B, he owes his success to the fact that Hitler trusts him and will allow him to carry out the sort of elastic defense that has been denied to other commanders. And you're right, the sword and shield plan that he comes up with is actually little more than a reiteration of standard German military doctrine, which is that the infantry will hold the front line, they will be your shield, but sooner or later the enemy is going to slip past that shield and is going to break through. And then you need mechanized forces operating behind that front line to launch energetic counterattacks to smash any enemy breakthrough and restore the front line. So the shield is the infantry, the sword are the Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions. So this is really no different from, normal German doctrine, but perhaps his genius lies in persuading Hitler that it's something new and coming up with a form of words that Hitler finds irresistible.
So I was just going to say about the sword and shield. I would, if you accept that the front line is going to be penetrated, it almost gives you, you can sell to Hitler the idea that you have to withdraw. No, we have to withdraw sometimes because we're going to do this. And it almost is a way of smoke and mirrors allowing you to withdraw.
Yes, and because he has this track record, particularly around the Rzhev salient, of very energetic counterattacks to restore the front line. Unlike Manstein, who Hitler blames for endlessly retreating and never retaking ground, Model has Hitler's confidence and is able to say, Mein Führer, we'll give up this ground, but look at the troops I've got squirreled away, ready for a counterattack. Don't worry, we will smash the Bolsheviks as soon as they're in an exposed position. The difficulty, though, is this isn't, as the Red Army has already discovered, this is really not good terrain for mobile operations. So even if he's able to concentrate forces, their ability to advance at the sort of pace required to make such tactics meaningful, particularly given that the balance of power is so heavily in favor of the Red Army, each counterthrust has to be executed quickly so that those divisions can then be freed up and used elsewhere. In the end, there is a great deal of smoke and mirrors here, but he manages to get permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal, and Army Group North manages to withdraw more or less intact to the western frontiers of the old Russian state, butting up against the Baltic states. It is conceivable at moments during that retreat that large parts of Army Group North might be cut off and destroyed, but on every occasion, the constraints of terrain, the constraints of logistics, of the weather, and of German resourcefulness mean that the Red Army is unable to take advantage of these opportunities, quite often, because of the heavily forested and swampy terrain, the lack of proper aerial reconnaissance. They're probably not even aware of how close they come to cutting off large bodies of German forces. So in the end, the Soviets are jubilant that they have driven the enemy back from Leningrad all the way to the Estonian frontier. And, in their memoirs, they kind of airbrush out the fact that yeah, but we could have done a great deal more here. They don't really approach that in that way. Their attitude is just look at what we achieved. And, in many respects, that's fair enough. Even that, given the enormous slaughter of the previous year when they barely moved the front line, yes, they've taken heavy casualties again this time, but look what they have achieved. They could have achieved more, but hey, it's still a big victory.
Well, after being static for years, months. It's a remarkable 100 plus miles advance in a short period of time, which does seem quite remarkable.
And yes, there were lost opportunities, there were missed opportunities. Army Group North could have been left in a far worse state. The other side of the argument was the Germans had opportunities for major counterattacks that weren't carried out too. So history is what it was, not what it might have been.
So as the guns can no longer be heard in Leningrad in that early part of 1944, what condition was the city in after? And I failed to notice. I 400? No, it's not 400 days. It's 2 years.
900 days.
900 days. There we go. 900 days of siege.
Not strictly 900, but it's too close to 900 to ignore the fact that it's a nice round number. Yeah. Parts of the city are in ruins. A lot of the city is in ruins. Much of the city has been depopulated because of the mass evacuation in the first winter and the terrible loss of life in that first winter. The people who are there are absolutely jubilant. They are exhausted. They are tired. Most of them are still suffering from malnutrition from that first winter. But my goodness, they have prevailed. No, they have stood up. And they have survived the worst siege certainly in living memory and arguably in history. They are still standing. Their city has endured. Again, this is a point where the people of Leningrad come into conflict with Stalin's view of history. The city has suffered enormously. It suffered terribly at the end of the First World War when there were widespread famines, and indeed those famines triggered the February and October revolutions that brought down first the Tsars and then the transitional government. It endured a series of famines in the years that followed every winter because of the diversion of so much rail traffic into the Russian Civil War. This is a city that, remember, this isn't like other capital cities of Europe, which have large agricultural hinterlands supplying them with food. The hinterland around Leningrad is largely forest and swamp. All the food has to be brought in from some distance, which is not possible in time of war. It then suffered again during the purges, and now it's suffered this terrible, terrible siege. And there is this defiant attitude amongst Leningraders of, yeah, look at us, we're still standing. For Stalin, this is not entirely welcome because already his view of how history is to be written is beginning to be imposed upon how the war is to be remembered. And Stalin's orthodox view, indeed Soviet orthodox historiography, is that the defeat of Nazism was a unique achievement made possible by the united will and strength of all of the people of the Soviet Union under the infallible leadership of the Communist Party, which in turn was led by the infallible Comrade Stalin. And anything that goes against this narrative is either played down or simply ignored. So all of the defeats get ignored, all of the disasters get whitewashed or airbrushed out of history. And it's perfectly okay to talk about the terrible suffering of Leningraders at the hands of the evil Nazis. It isn't so permissible to talk about the starvation of the city in the first year, because that kind of implies a criticism of the city authorities and of the communist authorities in allowing such a situation to arise. So, for example, all of the accounts of the siege talk about the survivors suffering from dystrophy. They avoid using the word emaciation because that carries its own connotations. So even before the Second World War is over, the unique experience of Leningrad is being downplayed by Lenin. First of all, he doesn't like the city. He's never liked the city. Too many of his rivals for power, people like Kirov, came from Leningrad, and he distrusts this difficult, intellectual, argumentative, stroppy city in the north. He's never liked Leningrad, and he certainly isn't going to give it any credit. If any single city is going to be associated with the great defeat of Nazism, it's going to be Stalingrad because it's got the right name. So already the extraordinary survival of ordinary Leningraders of the city is being downplayed, even as the siege is coming to an end.
Has it changed over time? I mean, in a post-Stalin, almost post-Soviet world, I'm not sure. I mean, how that is remembered. Has it changed over time? Is it remembered now like Stalingrad, or is Stalingrad still held up as being the defense of the nation?
There are several cities that have iconic status in Soviet and modern Russian remembrance of the Great Patriotic War. Stalingrad probably has pride of place in that, but a whole range of other cities play a part in this. Leningrad undoubtedly does. Also, in the context of the current war, Kursk and Sevastopol have great symbolic importance. The importance of the Ukrainian advance towards Kursk, it's a little bit like in Western Europe, an enemy force advancing towards Verdun. It has that sort of connotation for even for modern Russian thinking. It would be unthinkable for an army, moreover, an army equipped with German-built tanks, to be marching on Kursk. This is a huge and moral defeat for Putin, even though the advance hasn't reached Kursk. The very fact that they have entered Kursk Oblast is an enormous symbolic setback. So yes, Leningrad gradually assumed an importance. It did so within the constraints of official Soviet or Orthodox historiography at first, but after Stalin's death, gradually some of the other details began to come out. The Piskarevskoye cemetery was rebuilt as a memorial, but only after Stalin's death. And the official memorial to the siege in the southern part of the city was only unveiled in 1971. And even there are compromises. So there is this great memorial. And in typical brutalist Soviet style, it's built in the middle of a roundabout. You have to approach it by a long subway or risk your life and limb crossing the lanes of this roundabout. But there is an obelisk that rises above it, and the dates on the obelisk are 1941 to 1945. This is not the date of the siege. These are the dates of the war. But the memorial itself is unequivocally about the siege. There are several large statues outside the Memorial Museum, but even these have been criticized. So, for example, there are 2 women and the rest are all men, and people feel that there should have been more emphasis on the women who took part in the siege. The woman holding the dead child is remarkably well nourished, given that this was, during the siege. The other woman is a stretcher bearer, standing with the frontline soldiers. There was this feeling that, again, there was a degree of airbrushing of history. The Memorial Museum is an incredibly moving place to visit. It's built underneath this roundabout, a very, very powerful exhibit. And there you can see exhibits showing the official rations per day during the siege. And you just wonder how you could possibly survive on that, particularly given the bitterly cold temperatures, But a lot of that was added relatively late. Talk of many aspects of the siege itself did not even become commonplace until the end of the Soviet Union. There was absolutely no recognition of cannibalism, for example, until the end of the Soviet Union. In fairness, it should be pointed out that the terrible famine in Bengal in 1943, which resulted in about 8 million deaths, which has been largely airbrushed out of history in British accounts. There is even now no real recognition of the fact that cannibalism took place. It is such an extraordinarily painful thing for people to talk about that it's absolutely understandable that regardless of the political regime, it's not the kind of thing you want to be drawing attention to.
Prit, we're going to pause it there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Prit Butar, and we're discussing the Siege of Leningrad. Leningrad was the imperial city, wasn't it? It was built by the Tsars. When they rebuilt it, did they rebuild it in the model of the imperialist style, or did they decide to cast off the imperial Tsarist oppressor and build it in a nice modernist, communist style?
Already before the Second World War, Stalin had wanted to move the focus of the city away from the old imperial center. And a lot of the old sprawling shanties around the southern part of the city had been transformed into these housing blocks that were so typical of the Soviet era. The Communist Party headquarters, for example, is about 3 metro stops south of the old city center. And that was going to be the heart of Stalin's vision of Leningrad. To an extent, this was continued after the war with these extraordinary housing blocks being built all over the Soviet Union, over the Soviet Empire, but in particular in places like Leningrad. But all of the old palaces that had been damaged were carefully restored. The small town of Tsarskoye Selo, which is just outside Leningrad, had been behind the German siege lines, and the Germans had dynamited the Alexandra Palace and other palaces as they retreated. These were rebuilt, and part of the rebuilding was done using an extraordinary resource. All of the cameras that were taken from German prisoners of war had their films developed. And if they included pictures of those wrecked palaces before they were dynamited, they were handed over to those involved in the reconstruction so that they could be restored. There is an enormous ballroom in the palace which has the most beautiful ornate ceiling with embossed gilding of lilies and of roses, etc. Something ridiculous like 70% of that ceiling was extracted from the rubble and incredibly painstakingly jigsaw puzzled back together and then put in place. And then only about 30% was replacement for stuff that couldn't be replaced. Incredible quantities of material were spent on restoring the Winter Palace back to its old glory. Of course, not as a palace, but the Hermitage Museum was expanded so that this old imperial palace became a showpiece for Russian and Soviet culture and art, and for an awful lot of art that the Red Army appropriated all over Europe as it advanced towards Berlin. And other great buildings were also built. Leningrad itself is an extraordinary place. Even today, St. Petersburg is a wonderful, wonderful city. And I think it's a great tragedy that, for the foreseeable future, it remains pretty much off limits. The first time I visited the city in the early 2000s, the old Victory Arch that had been set up in the southern outskirts of the city through which Leningrad is returning from the war had marched, had been largely restored. It was taken down under Stalin's orders, but they had restored it in the 1960s and 70s. And when I first drove from the airport to my hotel in the center of the city, you passed through under this arch, and there was in Cyrillic, there was a great caption across the top of it that said, "Welcome to St. Petersburg, hero city of Leningrad." It still embraced every aspect of its past. And when you go to the Field of Mars, there is still an eternal flame to the defenders of Petrograd. It's a city that hasn't forgotten its many manifestations, even if the rest of the Soviet Union has kind of tried to turn its back on that past.
Talking of memorialisation, I only have really one other question. Those men of the Spanish Blue Division, are they commemorated anyway? Are they remembered in Spain?
It's a funny thing, not really, because they were on the wrong side. So the division was officially disbanded even as the Germans were being driven back from the outskirts of Leningrad. It endured a very difficult retreat under constant attack from partisans. The Germans provided very little by way of logistic support for it. And then its remaining personnel were put on trains to go back to Spain. Many volunteered to stay in German uniform. These were people they had fought in the Spanish Civil War. They had then fought on the Eastern Front. In every army, there are people who are so accustomed to war that it has become a way of life for them. And instead of the Spanish division, they then formed the Spanish Legion, which became part of the SS. And these guys were present in Berlin at the final battles around the Reichstag and elsewhere. But the rest of the division returned home. Many of them were scarred both physically and mentally by their experiences. Many refused to talk about what had happened to them. Those who did often did so in a very selective manner. And as with so much of Spain's fascist past, the Blue Division is one of these, I guess, inconvenient bits of history that Spain finds it very difficult to remember because of all of the connotations associated with it. In many respects, if you imagine some of the questionable conduct of, let's say, British troops during the British Empire, none of those episodes tend to get much attention. All of the attention is always on what those regiments did in rather more favourable and more approvable settings. But for units like the Blue Division, there were almost no such favorable recollections. Pretty much all of their memories were associated with a regime that was universally recognized as being terrible and with terrible crimes on the Eastern Front, etc. So it's not particularly surprising that that division has never, some of the veterans in the years that followed the war set up various associations and wanted greater commemoration. And during the Franco era, there were some attempts to have some commemorations, but certainly after the Franco era, it was something that was a distasteful part of the fascist past and better forgotten than commemorated in any real way.
Very good. Well, thanks, Prit. It is always a pleasure to talk with you. Folks, if you want to read more about the lifting of the siege of Leningrad, Prit's book is Hero City, Leningrad 1943-44. Now, loyal listener, as a fan of the World War II podcast, I'm sure you would want to enhance your listening experience. So why not consider becoming a patron? By joining the patron community at patreon.com/WW2podcast, you can enjoy ad-free episodes, allowing you to immerse yourself fully in each episode. But that's not all. Patrons also get exclusive access to extra unreleased content. These bonus bits delve deeper into the topics covered. Your support on Patreon helps me keep the podcast running and growing, enabling me to bring you even more high-quality content without interruptions. If you're ready for an ad-free, richer experience, visit patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's it for this episode. I think we'll be looking at Canada in the next show. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.